Birmingham, Alabama, 1957. Odessa is 34, climbing the back porch steps of a house she has cleaned for 6 years. In her hand, a paper sack with a folded apron, a coin purse with exact bus fare, a key that opens only the kitchen door. Under that sink waits a bar of soap that isn't hers to share. Every object marks a line she didn't draw. And number 12 will show you the line wasn't personal, it was the law. Number 12, the backdoor rule. The screen door is already swinging before Odessa's foot touches the top step. Spring creaks, gravel shifts underneath her shoes. This door, never the front one. In Jim Crow households across the South, this wasn't a suggestion. Oral histories collected from black domestic workers describe it again and again. The front door belonged to the family and to guests. The back door belonged to her. No sign said so. No one needed to write it down. A white woman might never mention it directly, and her children would learn it anyway, the way they learned which fork to use. Refuse the rule, even once, and the consequence wasn't a conversation. It was suspicion, a neighbor noticing, a complaint that could cost a job built over years in a single afternoon. The door looked like architecture. It was rank, repeated every single morning before she'd said a word to anyone inside. That was the easy rule. The bathroom was harder. Number 11, the bathroom that wasn't hers. 6 hours into a workday, and there's a basement door Odessa knows by heart. Concrete floor, bare bulb, the bleach smell that never quite leaves. In many Southern households, the family bathroom simply wasn't available to her. Some homes had a separate outdoor toilet. Some had none designated at all, which meant waiting, timing, planning a body's most basic need around a household that hadn't planned for her to have one. This wasn't whispered about. A private need turned into a daily negotiation. Sometimes a daily humiliation, depending on the house and the woman who ran it. Nobody had to enforce this with a raised voice. The architecture did the enforcing. A door that didn't exist was its own kind of rule. If the bathroom had a boundary, the kitchen sink had one too. And that one was even smaller, even stranger, even harder to explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. Number 10, the other bar of soap. Under the sink, second shelf, behind the cleaning rags, her own bar of soap, her own thin towel kept apart from the family's. This detail surfaces over and over in oral histories, one woman recalling she wasn't even allowed to use the family washpan. The logic never made sense on its own terms. She cleaned every surface in the house with her hands. Those same hands somehow still needed their own soap, separate from everyone else's. The rule wasn't about hygiene. Hygiene was the excuse. It was about distance, maintained in the smallest possible object, refreshed every single day she came back to work. A washcloth doesn't sound like a powerful thing. In this house, it was doing a job far bigger than getting anyone clean. Her hands ran the household. Her hands still weren't trusted with the family towel. And her name carried the same kind of asymmetry, just louder. Number 9. Her name was never hers to keep. A child's voice calls across the kitchen. First name only, no title, no hesitation. Odessa is 34, the child is 8. Oral history after oral history from this period describes the same pattern. White employers addressed formally by Mr. or Mrs. and a surname, while the black women working in their homes were addressed only by first name, regardless of age, regardless of how long they'd worked there. It wasn't rudeness exactly, it was structure, dressed as familiarity. Correcting it, even gently, risked being read as insolence. A dangerous word in a Jim Crow household, one that could end employment overnight, so the name stayed small. A formality the family kept for itself, and withheld from the woman who kept their house running. It's such a small thing, a name. That's exactly why it worked. The next rule came with a paycheck attached, and the paycheck told its own story. Number 8. The uniform that wasn't required but was. The apron in Odessa's paper sack is plain cotton, folded the same way every morning, slightly stiff with starch. No law required it. No handbook existed for most of these jobs at all. But domestic service guides circulating at the time made the apron close to mandatory anyway. Arrive without it, and something shifted. A look, a comment, a sense that she hadn't presented herself properly. The apron did two things at once. It signaled competence. She knew how to work. And it signaled rank. She was staff, visibly, the moment she walked in. Clothing this plain shouldn't carry that much weight. It carried it anyway. The apron was about appearance. What came next was about money, and money had almost no rules protecting it at all. Number 7. Day's work, no paper trail. At the end of the day, Odessa counts coins into her purse. Exact change for the bus fare home. The rest folded into a pocket. No pay stub, no receipt. No ledger anywhere with her name and her hours written down. This was common enough to have a name. Day's work, paid in cash, off the books, with no formal record connecting her labor to any government system. It sounds almost convenient until you follow it forward. No record meant no proof of income. No proof of income meant no employment history. No employment history meant nothing to show, decades later, for a working life that was entirely real. The labor was real. The exhaustion was real. The money in her hand was real. The official record of any of it was nearly non-existent. That absence wasn't an accident. It was allowed, and the next part of this story explains exactly why it was allowed. Because the answer wasn't sitting in any one household. It was sitting in Washington. Until now, the rules lived at the door, at the sink, in the sound of her own name. The next rules lived in federal law written down, voted on, signed. Number 6. Left out of the New Deal. Picture a Social Security card that, for this job, never got issued because the job itself wasn't covered. When the Social Security Act passed in 1935, domestic and agricultural workers were excluded from its old age benefits by name. This wasn't an oversight buried in fine print. Senate floor records from that year show the exclusion was debated and contested even then, with at least one senator arguing on the floor that singling out farm and domestic labor for exclusion was unfair to everyone else being taxed under the new law. The exclusion stood anyway. For women like Odessa, that meant decades of labor accumulating toward nothing, no benefit, no account, no safety net waiting at the end of it. A blank line sat where an account number should have been. Congress left her out once, in 1935. 3 years later, it did it again, and this time, it touched her wage itself. Number 5. No union, no bargaining, no floor. There was no number underneath what Odessa was paid. No legal minimum. No required overtime. Nothing stopping a long day from simply continuing past the hour she should have gone home. Domestic and agricultural workers were explicitly excluded from the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which would have given them the right to organize, and again, from the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which set the country's first federal minimum wage and overtime protections. Historians studying the period describe these exclusions as deliberate, pushed specifically by Southern legislators, aware that the workforce being excluded was disproportionately black. This wasn't incidental drafting. It was the point. So the wage stayed whatever the household decided it should be, with no legal floor underneath it and no legal door open to organizing for a better one. Even the most famous civil rights law of the century would carry its own quiet exception. Number 4. The Civil Rights Act that skipped her. A radio plays through a half-open window while Odessa works news of a new law, Title VII, banning employment discrimination across the country. It sounds, on the radio, like it should change everything. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 applied only to employers with 15 or more employees. A household employing one domestic worker fell outside that threshold entirely. The most celebrated employment protection of the era, the one most people remember as the turning point, simply didn't reach into the house she worked in. The law existed. It just wasn't built to find her. That contradiction sits at the center of the whole era. A civil rights victory loud enough to reach a kitchen radio, and quiet enough, in its actual text, to leave the woman standing in that kitchen completely untouched. And the irony runs deeper, because women exactly like her had already helped win a civil rights victory of their own, years earlier, on foot. Number 3, the boycott she helped win, on foot. Worn leather, soles thinning, miles walked before sunrise instead of a ride on a segregated bus. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 1956 is remembered as one moment, one bus, one name. Its actual engine, day after day for over a year, was the thousands of black domestic workers who walked to work, organized carpools, and refused to ride rather than accept segregated seating, sustaining the boycott long enough for it to succeed. Odessa stands in for all of them here. The same women excluded from union rights, from minimum wage, from the civil rights law that would come a decade later. were the ones who carried one of the century's defining victories on their own 2 feet. They changed the country from the outside. Almost nothing changed yet on the inside the kitchens, inside the pay envelopes, inside the rules at the back door. One law was still coming, decades behind schedule. Number 2, the law that finally noticed, decades late. A pay envelope, sometime after 1974, with a number printed on it that the law now required. Amendments to the Fair Labor Standards Act that year finally extended minimum wage and overtime protections to many domestic workers nearly 40 years after the original 1935 and 1,938 exclusions. Even this came with limits. Workers caring for children or the elderly were carved out again, a pattern repeating itself almost exactly. For a woman who had already spent decades working without that protection, the change arrived after most of a working life was already finished. The ink on a new pay envelope might have looked ordinary. It represented something the federal government had refused to acknowledge for almost 4 decades. One number is left to explain. It's the one that ties every rule on this list back to a single, uncomfortable source. Number 1. None of it was personal. Back to the screen door. Back to the key that opens only the kitchen. Back to the soap kept apart, the name said without a title, the wages with no floor beneath them. None of it, taken individually, looks like more than a household habit, the kind of small custom families convince themselves is simply tradition. Lined up together, it stops looking like custom. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, the Social Security Act of 1935, the Civil Rights Act's narrow threshold in 1964, 4 separate pieces of federal law, each one written, debated, and signed, and each one leaving this exact occupation outside its protection. In a workforce, historians describe as disproportionately black by design. The back door wasn't really about doors. The separate soap wasn't really about cleanliness. They were small, daily versions of something much larger that the law had already decided in writing. The door was never just a door. Ending 70 words. The screen door swings shut behind Odessa one more time. Same spring, same creak. The key still opens only the kitchen. But the door means something different now, not a household habit, but a pattern written into law 4 separate times. If a backdoor rule, a day's work job, or a grandmother's name said without a title lives somewhere in your family's memory, tell us below. Subscribe and come with us to the next hidden rule.